right, welcome everybody to one of the things that I have been looking forward to the most for SequoiaCon, and getting to hear from Dr. Agarwal. I've got a couple of things I want to share before we hand it over to her to share the main keynote of the event. But first, just want to welcome you to day two, and just want to say thanks so much for being here. Thanks for making the effort, taking the time, getting your accounts payable to, write a check or get a credit card issued. I know these things are not easy. I know getting subs is not easy. Getting people to cover things and move around meetings, all these things take investment. And we are so appreciative that you would prioritize this and make it a part of your day, your week, your year. Just want to share a couple of bits of feedback that we got from yesterday. The biggest of which is, hey, this is great, but what are we gonna do after this? Like, there's so much. I've heard people saying like, my mind is like mush a little bit. There's so many good things, so many good resources. What are we gonna do now? And this is something we've been thinking a lot about. I showed this picture yesterday at the very beginning of this idea of the sequoias and how we envision this conference as a place where we could go and kind of get the support. Like, this is how sequoias grow up. They grow up in these kind of pods that support each other, and they make each other stronger. And that was the metaphor that we wanted to take with this conference. But what we've heard is that, while we've been kind of standing here amongst the sequoias, that this is maybe more the felt reality. That this little, sprigling of a tree, that's how we feel. And it's this, like, what do we do now? How are we going to grow up, and start doing the things that we see happening at New View or St. Vrain, or any of the places where our speakers are from. And so something that we've been talking about at Evergreen is, how do we support schools, not just at this mountaintop moment, but really over a longer period of time? Because we know these changes don't just happen overnight. They really happen over a long period of time. And so what we want to share with y'all is something we're launching this summer. It's called the AI Academy. It's going to be a year-long program running July to May that really allows districts, usually probably districts, teams of people is ideal. People who are in charge of their next year's AI strategy, to join us on a 10-step program, basically plan to cover every facet of AI that a district needs to look at, and to do that in a cohort model. And so you're not just going to be learning from the Evergreen team and the experts that we source, but you're going to be learning from each other, and you're going to have the chance to bounce things off of each other and share ideas, share best practices, etc. This is something we're going to be opening a few spots for districts who want to join in. The details are on the website right now if you go to evergreened.ai, and we'd love to hear if this might be right for your district. One thing with that is, we know that while there are some core things that everybody needs to do, there's also a million and one different ways that your district is thinking about the priorities for the year ahead. And what we want to do is, we want to also allow your district, if the AI Academy sounds like something interesting, we also want to provide the opportunity to do specializations. So whether your district is focused on culture and climate, or college readiness, or differentiation, we want to allow the opportunity for you to opt in sort of on electives, where you can actually dig into, what does AI mean for these things, for math instruction, for ELD, for data. And so that'll be a part of the AI program. And the other thing too we're going to do with this is, we're going to actually make these open enrollment. So this summer, July 22nd to 25th, that's far from now. Everyone is surely dreaming of these days, and can't imagine the idea of sitting through sessions on these days. But we are going to open up each of these little micro courses, make them really accessible, very affordable to anybody. And these would be great, instead of sort of your big kind of district level team. This is going to be great for a department head, or maybe an administrator who's in charge of literacy, or who's in charge of maybe staff wellness for the year to come, and thinking about what could AI do in these realms. Not to just wave a magic wand and everything is better, but if you listen to Derek's keynote yesterday, how do we take what's already proven, it's already effective, and make it even better, cheaper, faster with AI. And that'll be the focus of conversation with the Week of AI. That's also on our website. If you have any questions about it, let us know. We are very open to feedback, and we aren't trying to create more noise or hoops or hassles in the world. We're just trying to help schools. And if you think this is something that might help your school or your district, let us know. You know how to reach us. All right. With that, I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to hand over to Derek to introduce us to our keynote.
Sure. And we've got some slide coming up. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote, Dr. Pooja Agarwal. Dr. Agarwal is a cognitive scientist who has been conducting research on how students learn since 2005. She's the author of the book Powerful Teaching, which you can find on the conference portal and pictured on the slide, Unleash the Science of Learning. And she's also an associate professor of psychology at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, teaching psychological science to exceptional undergraduate musicians. Dr. Agarwal is also the founder of retrievalpractice.org, which that QR code will take you to, a source of research-based teaching strategies for more than 20,000 teachers around the world. And we also, just 5 minutes ago, linked that on the website so you can find it on your conference portal. Dr. Agarwal's research has been published in leading peer-reviewed academic journals, including the New York Times, NPR, Scientific American, and Education Week. She's been recognized by the National Science Foundation and highlighted in numerous books, podcasts, and videos. Dr. Agarwal has received her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. Her love of learning formed at the outset of her career as a 4th and 5th grade teacher in St. Louis, Missouri. Her favorite book is The Giver by Lois Lowry. Her favorite movie is The Princess Bride, and her favorite student is yours truly. I was blessed to have her as a professor at Vanderbilt University, and I have secondhand goosebumps for all of you all because you get to experience the greatness that I got to each and every class period. So again, without further ado, and with great pleasure, I introduce to you Dr. Pooja Agarwal.
Oh, hello, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. And a big thank you to Derek for inviting me. Of course, like all of us as teachers, I invite you to turn on your video if you are so comfortable, because we all feed off of the people in the room. So if you are comfortable, I'd love to see you, because I know all of us sat through Zoom land for quite a while. So thank you for turning those on. We're going to jump right in. As a teacher, I want to get us warmed up. So I have a question for you. I'm going to pose the question. I've got multiple choice answers. This is not for grade, so don't cheat. And you can just type your answer into the chat, okay? How many bones are in the adult human body? Is it A, 124, B, 126, or C, 206? So you can go ahead and type that into the chat, please. A, 124, B, 186, or C, 206. And a lot of you must be science teachers, because you're correct. The answer is 206. And yes, more than 4 is correct. Also, I specified the adult human body because I had a very kind teacher correct me that as children, we're born with more than 206 bones. And so 206, we all pretty much have 206 bones. As Derek and Ryan mentioned, I've got a lot of the resources I'm going to share with you here also available on my website at retrievalpractice.org/evergreen. I've got free downloads, more information about my book, Powerful Teaching. You can subscribe for a newsletter. I've got some of these slides available. I figured retrievalpractice.org/Sequoia would be a whole thing to spell. So I went with retrievalpractice.org/evergreen. So you can find more information there, and I'll put the link in the chat. I invite you to continue using the chat throughout our session, and Derek will be moderating some Q&A in a bit. So to introduce myself a little bit more fully, I'm Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a cognitive scientist. I've been conducting research on how students learn for almost 20 years at this point. And I'm also a teacher, just like all of us here. I'm a teacher. I teach at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. I've been teaching for about 20 years, starting in elementary school and then also teaching high school, undergrad, and graduate students, including Derek. He does not know that I have this photo of us from literally 5 years ago. So I went and dug up this photo when I was on faculty at Vanderbilt teaching the online Ed.D program that Derek took. And so Derek was one of my students, and I've been so fortunate to keep in touch with him. So again, it means so much to me. And of course, like you all, to have our students keep in touch and to reach out. So thank you again, Derek. I just had to include that screenshot. And also this was 5 years ago, which blows my mind, when we had already started using Zoom for Vanderbilt before the pandemic. So thanks, Derek. This is what my classroom also looked like a number of years ago at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. I have students from literally all around the world. About 40% of my students are international, and about 30% of my students are English language learners. If you're not familiar with the Berklee College of Music, I like to describe it as it being like Juilliard, but cooler. So we focus on contemporary music, jazz, rock, K-pop, pop, Latin music, African music, all kinds of contemporary music. So I am fortunate to teach the science of learning and neuroscience to musicians. Like many of us, we then transitioned to Zoom. This is what my classroom looked like for about a year and a half. And then this is what my classroom looked like a little bit after that. And now here is what the vibe is and what my classroom looks like today. So I'm very fortunate to be in the classroom. I wanted to come to SequoiaCon yesterday, but I was actually in the classroom all day from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. But it looks like it's been a fantastic conference, and I can't wait to hear more. So I really love teaching my students every day, especially here in Boston. Now, I'd like us to think about our own individual educational experiences. So I'd like you to think back and pick a course that you took in high school or college, and a class that you had to study really hard for. Maybe you had to cram. This is anxiety provoking. I often think about a Greek mythology class that I took in college. There was so much to memorize about all the different stories and mythologies and characters. I pulled all-nighters, I crammed for the exams. So I hope, feel free to type in the chat what course you are thinking of where it was just kind of high pressure. You had to do all this cramming. 2 people put organic chemistry right away. I love it. Yeah. This is stressful for us, and this is stressful for our students. And maybe you cram like me, and hooray, maybe you got an A on that midterm, that final, that paper. And then afterwards, what happens? So you've crammed, you've got an A, and then what happened? Kara says, purge. We forget it all. And for me and for our students, this is really frustrating. Our students spend so much time and energy cramming and learning, and then they forget everything. And of course, for us, this is frustrating as teachers. How often, myself included, have students said, well, I never learned that, or you never taught that. And you're like, I just taught that to you 3 weeks ago or last semester. And so for us as teachers and faculty and district leaders, we get into this frustration of having to reteach and reteach. Our students cram and cram, we reteach and reteach. And this has really driven a lot of my research and my interests, which is, why do students forget? And from a practical standpoint, what can we as educators do about it? Now, almost 100 years of research from cognitive science demonstrates something that we already know. A lot of learning happens when we get information into our students' heads. This is a very simplified model of memory and learning, where we call this first stage encoding. We lecture, we talk to our students, they watch YouTube videos, we'll talk about ChatGPT, they take notes, they reread. That's all encoding. That's getting information into their heads. And we hope it stores there, we hope it sticks, and then we ask them to get information out of their heads. Now, this 100 years of research demonstrates that getting information out of our heads is where a lot of the magic of learning happens. So often, we typically focus on getting information into our heads, but the magic of learning is when we get information out of our heads. And this is what we call retrieval practice. Just like a Labrador retriever goes to get something and then mentally brings it back to mind, that's that retrieval. And of course, engaging in that practice. So one way I've learned a sort of analogy I talk about with my students at the Berklee College of Music is just like they practice their instruments. We also need to practice our knowledge. My students can't cram the night before a big performance or audition or gig. They have to practice what they're learning every day. And so when it comes to science, math, STEM, humanities, language, arts, tech, we need our students to practice their knowledge. Now, I want to back up just a little bit from that basic premise to talk about AI. And I loved looking through all the materials. I saw some information about how a lot of students, a lot of educators, a lot of parents have had negative experiences with AI. What do we do about it now? And what does that mean in the context of cognitive science and learning? So what about AI? Based on research, I'm encouraging all of us to focus more on getting information out of students' heads. And understandably, you and your students might be thinking, well, if I have to focus on this output, I can just use ChatGPT, no problem. So why do I need to learn things? I can just look it up. I can just ask ChatGPT or some other AI tool. And what I want to share with you is effective strategies, research-based strategies that emphasize learning. So yeah, we learn stuff when we Google it or we use ChatGPT, but one way I like to think about it, and I honestly can't remember who to attribute this quote to, so feel free to put in the chat and let me know. This quote sticks out to me, which is that in order for our students to think, they need something to think about. I see a lot of nods. In order for our students to think, they need to have something to think about. And that really resonates with me. I want my students to learn beyond just looking up information on Google. So I'm going to share with you research-based strategies that kind of get to that question that Ryan had mentioned is, what do we do now? And maybe we can't make changes overnight, but I really want to share some strategies I use that maybe you can use on Monday. I'll talk about those practical strategies. Then I've chosen to only share a tiny bit of research. We'll have time for a Q&A, and then I'll share a little bit more. When it comes to our classrooms, whether you're a school leader or a classroom teacher, one thing we typically do is we start class by reviewing. All right, class, here's what we talked about yesterday. Here's what we talked about last week. That's reviewing information. That's focusing on the encoding stage of getting information into students' heads. A simple switch you can make on Monday is retrieval. Rather than telling students, here's what we did last week, you can simply ask students, what did we do last week? They can jot it down, they could turn and talk, they could raise their hand and share one or two things, but it's a simple switch. And that 2 minutes we would have spent reviewing, we can just use those 2 minutes more effectively for retrieval. So very simple switch based on 100 years of research. Another simple strategy I hope you'll think about how to incorporate on Monday is what we call a brain dump. And this is simply asking students to write down everything they can remember that they've learned from a lesson or from the week or from the semester. So write down everything you've learned about ancient Egypt. In my classes, write down everything they've learned about research on sleep or developmental psychology. Even for math, write down everything you've learned about what slopes are. You can have students write this down freely, kind of like a stream of consciousness. In the research literature, we call this free recall. And this is much more engaging than asking students to write out a definition for something. It's just simply writing down what they can remember. And I emphasize to my students that this isn't about spelling, this isn't about grammar, this is all part of retrieval practice. Okay, another simple strategy that I like is to more specifically ask students to retrieve two things. I like this in my classroom because it's a little bit more snappy. It works a little bit more quickly. It takes a little pressure off from the first time students retrieve in my class. They're like, you want me to write a paper right now? So I just say, no, just write down two things you've learned. What are two things you remember from the previous class? It could be three things, it could be four things. I kind of like the alliteration and simplicity of just write down two things you've learned. Okay. One thing we can also do is ask our students, what did you learn in class today? And as a parent, if on the way home, you ask your child, what did you learn in school today? Your child might say, nothing. And that's because it's a really too simple of a question. So think about asking your students or asking your children, what did you learn in school yesterday? So not what did you learn in school today, but this added mental challenge of retrieving what students learned yesterday is what we also call a desirable difficulty. It takes retrieval practice and it levels it up. Another example or a way you could incorporate it in the classroom is as an entry ticket. You could provide an exit ticket, what did you learn in class today? Or an entry ticket could be, what did you learn in class yesterday? Another simple research-based strategy you can implement, I hope, as soon as Monday. This doesn't require a big old revamp of your courses or content. Okay, if you can, raise your hand on camera or with the reaction if you use Think, Pair, Share in your classroom. If you're familiar with this strategy, if you use it, yeah, the majority or a fair number of us. Oh, Zoom has this new thing where it pops up with the hands in a different way. So a lot of us use Think, Pair, Share. Here's a photograph of my students, my college students doing Think, Pair, Share. You provide students with a prompt, you ask them to think about it silently, then they pair up and then they chat with each other, and then we typically have them share with the whole class. What I found in my own experience is that students aren't given enough time to think. We like that pair and share because then that's the engagement that we feed off of in our classrooms. I want to encourage you to not skip the think step. That's where that magic sauce of learning happens, is retrieval. So for that think moment, that mental moment, you can encourage your students, silence is golden. We are going to awkwardly sit here for a solid 30 seconds or a minute and just think. And the first time you do this, I promise it may feel a little uncomfortable because our students aren't engaging, but that's when the learning happens, right? They don't have to be verbally engaging. So make sure you don't skip the think step. One thing I do is I have my students write down their thoughts. Then that way they have it in front of them before they pair and share. Okay. I want to emphasize that you know your content best, whether you're teaching STEM classes, you're teaching language arts, you know your content best, which is why even these 3 or 4 strategies I've mentioned, I haven't specified the content area because research shows that they improve students' long-term learning in a variety of content areas. And this is also where our creativity as educators comes in. How can you adapt the 2 things strategy for your classroom? How can you adapt a brain dump in your classroom? So please think about your own creativity. I hope you have some time within your districts or schools or here at SequoiaCon to chat with others who teach in your content area and use your own creativity because you know your content best. Now, I'm a skeptical person, especially as a teacher. I'm like, you want me to do what? I'm not going to do this. Nope, nope, nope. So you may be already feeling skeptical. For example, is all this retrieval practice going to require more prep? Absolutely not. None of us want more prep. I don't want more prep. You probably don't want to spend more time preparing for class or preparing for the week or preparing for the school year. So retrieval practice does not require more prep time. Does it require more class time? No. You're using your class time more effectively when you use these strategies. Again, instead of reviewing information, is to retrieve it. If you take 30 seconds to write down 2 things, it engages students in a new way. It engages that mental muscle of theirs. And so they're increasing their long-term learning. And actually then it decreases the amount of reteaching we have to do. So it saves you class time in the short term and in the long term. Does retrieval practice require more grading? No. Not only do we not want more prep, none of us want more grading. None of us want more grading. You don't have to grade retrieval practice at all. That's kind of wild. We have an educational system that encourages us to think about anytime our students retrieve, we have to grade it. And you don't have to grade this at all. If I ask my students to retrieve 2 things, then at the end of class, they'll often come up to me with a piece of paper and go, here you go. And I like to just look at them. And I just say, so what are you doing? Why are you handing me your paper? They're like, well, don't you want it? I'm like, why would I want it? And they're like, well, don't you want to grade it? And I just love smiling at them and saying, no, I'm not going to grade this. Using what you know and retrieving it doesn't have to be for a grade at all. So using these strategies does not involve more grading. And am I advocating for something like more testing? Absolutely not. This is not testing our students. This is not more standardized testing because retrieval practice is a learning strategy. It's not an assessment strategy. So focusing on retrieval as formative assessment for us as teachers, but think also about it as formative learning for our students. It's not an assessment strategy. This is to improve their long-term learning. Another way I phrase it with my students is they're going to spend with my semester-long courses, they're going to spend 15 weeks with me. And just like all of us in college, we've forgotten a lot of what we learned in college. I want my students to remember what they're learning beyond my 15-week semester, beyond the school year. I hope that if I were to track them down 5 years from now, they would remember something. So we really want to emphasize that long-term learning. What's really cool is you already do this. We're all good teachers. We're all here at SequoiaCon to be even better educators, to create better systems and districts and schools. So you already do this. I'm not asking you to throw out the baby with the bathwater, okay? We all ask our students questions. A lot of us use Think, Pair, Share, so you already do this. I do like this mental switch of instead of focusing on getting information in, is getting information out. So one of my simplest favorite tools for retrieval practice is simply asking something again. How many bones are in the adult human body? Can you type that into the chat for me? It's 206. Right, great. And then you can just move on. You don't have to engage students in a think, pair, share. I love using pencil and paper. Absolutely love it. I think technology has a great role in our classrooms. I use all kinds of tech tools I'll tell you about in a second, but the simplicity of pen and paper or pencil and a paper works really well. I also highly recommend index cards. How often, whether you teach 5th grade or 9th grade or college students, when you ask students to take out a piece of paper, then they're like taking out their notebooks and going through their backpacks and then ripping out paper, and you've got that gross fringe on the side. None of us want that gross fringe. So I like handing out index cards to my students, or as they come in the classroom, they grab an index card so that randomly in the middle of the lesson, I can ask them to retrieve 1 or 2 things. With the index cards, what's nice is that I can collect them, I can shuffle them around, I can hand them back to other students. And so everything's just kind of tidy and neat in a very small way. So my students don't have to go digging through their backpacks. So I used index cards just yesterday with 60 of my students. Okay. There are plenty of tech apps, Kahoot, Quizlet. I use one called Slido. Mentimeter is another one, right? You can use all kinds of tech apps that you probably already use because you're already engaging students in retrieval practice. You can engage students in retrieval practice asynchronously. I use Google Forms. My students have weekly retrieval practices. They're sort of like mini quizzes where they complete these Google Forms I have built outside of class, and they're only worth 2% of students' grades. Because they have these small, low stakes Google Forms every week, they can complete these on their own, and then we talk about their thoughts during class. And of course, you can engage students in retrieval practice online synchronously. We've already done that with the chat, and we'll be doing a little bit more of that, okay? Some more research-based tips that I want to share is to try to encourage or include retrieval practice as often as possible. Research, me and my colleagues have looked at research for more than 50 classroom experiments conducted in real schools, mostly in K-12, and there isn't an optimal amount of retrieval practice. I know sometimes a lot of us want a recipe, like how often should I do this, or which days, or for how long? And research suggests just simply as often as possible. Nope. Another is to keep retrieval practice flexible and quick. I have found that then this de-emphasizes retrieval as assessment. By keeping it quick, it's just a learning strategy instead of an assessment strategy. Keep it low stakes, or as I mentioned, you don't have to grade retrieval practice at all. It's kind of a relief to give ourselves this permission to not have to grade everything students retrieve. So you don't have to grade Kahoots. You don't have to grade Google Forms. You don't have to grade what students put into a chat or on an index card. Now, in terms of our students, all of these strategies I've mentioned are things that I hope you can incorporate immediately. And I have a lot of conversations with my college students about how they can use these exact same strategies at home. So if you're a parent, as a district leader, you can encourage your students to recall 2 things after they read a book or after they've done their homework for that day. Parents can get involved and ask their children, write down everything you remember from school today or from yesterday, right? One way I get students on board with this way of thinking about learning is I ask them 3 questions. And I hope you as leaders, educators, parents can also ask your students these 3 questions. First, how do you study? Simple question. How do you study? Whether it's for science, math, language arts, or any other classes, why do you study that way? Is it because a parent taught you, a teacher taught you? Did you just kind of come up with this on your own? And I love this question, does it work? Because so often my students will look at me and go, kinda? It's like, yeah, let's talk about that kinda a little bit. Because a lot of the way we study, a lot of the way our students study works in the short term. We cram, we get an A on the exam. It works in the short term. Then that kind of feeling is like, yeah, but then I forget it all and I have to restudy and restudy again. So does it work? Kinda. And your students will recognize that that can be frustrating. I have a lot of study strategy tips on my website at retrievalpractice.org/students. So there you can send students and parents where I've got recommended videos, blogs, podcast interviews, all with great tips from scientists. So not just here's how I've been doing it, so here's how you should study, but a full list of recommended resources by scientists. I'd also encourage you to check out my Powerful Teaching co-author, Patrice Bain, has a parent's guide to powerful teaching. So that is also linked there. Okay. Now, just like you know your content best, you know your students best. As creative educators, you can adapt these study strategies, you can adapt these teaching strategies for 4th graders, for 12th graders. They really are flexible. And that's something I love about this area of research is learning's kind of universal. I also have, as I mentioned, about 30% of my students are English language learners. And I find that these strategies are helpful for them in a way that they're not put on the spot, not even just cold calling, but when they have that mental moment to think before the parents share or to write something down on an index card, they've already been able to either think in their own language, write it down in English, and then they can communicate even better. So I've learned a lot from my students, and I hope you will be creative in adapting this for your students. Now, I want to share a tiny, tiny bit of research on learning. I have taken more than 100 years of research and distilled it down into about 4 pictures. I've chosen to not show graphs at all. I have plenty of this on my website. I'll put the link in the chat at retrievalpractice.org/research, but I'm just going to share a little sliver of that research. So one, as I mentioned, is that me and my colleagues did a literature review, a meta-analysis of sorts of legit experiments in authentic classrooms. A lot of retrieval practice research has been conducted in laboratories with very simplistic materials. And we looked at what are K-12 students doing in the classroom? What are university and graduate student faculty doing in the classroom? And overwhelmingly, the majority of these experiments demonstrated medium to large effect sizes. So retrieval practice consistently benefited student learning across ages, content areas, different subjects, different formats. I've also published research looking at how retrieval practice improves higher order learning. This is not just for vocabulary. This is not just for memorization. I published research looking at both 6th graders and college students where simply retrieving what you know facilitates transfer of knowledge to new situations, facilitates broadening that knowledge to related content. So for example, here, there's research showing that when medical students engage in retrieval practice while they're learning CPR, they better perform CPR than if they just read the instructions or watch YouTube videos. That makes sense. When we practice our knowledge becomes more complex and we can engage in critical thinking. We've also shown for more than 10 years of research in a school district in Illinois that retrieval practice improves students' grades from a C to an A level and improves their long-term learning for content they learned in September. They still do better retrieving that content by May. We also have done surveys of more than 1,000 6th through 12th graders where we demonstrated that retrieval practice reduced their anxiety. At first, it sounds like all of this is like testing and it's going to make our students really nervous, but it actually reduces their anxiety because our students are more comfortable with what they know and what they don't know. They're ready and better prepared for assessments. They feel more confident in their knowledge when they're writing or writing on exams, completing exams, writing papers. So all of this engaging students actually reduces their anxiety throughout the school year. I want to mention also that I've got a list on my website at retrievalpractice.org/scientists. These are the leading scientists in the field of cognitive psychology doing the most recent and most applicable research on strategies we talk about in my book, Powerful Teaching, on retrieval practice, spacing, metacognition, interleaving. So I've got this list here that specifically focuses on people of color, women, LGBTQ+, and mid-career faculty and scientists. These are all teachers. We all have teaching experience as well, and they're from all over the United States and all over the world. So if you're interested in conducting research at your school, or you'd like someone to give a talk to you or your parents, please, please reach out to these scientists on my website. I hope it is a helpful resource for you. Now, this is your turn to engage in some retrieval practice. You've already had a day of SequoiaCon. I'd like you to take a moment and not look at any of your notes. So just humor me. Take out a piece of paper, open up a Google Doc, type into the chat 2 things you have learned at SequoiaCon so far. It could be 2 things from our interactions here on Zoom. It could be 2 things from yesterday. It could be 2 things from this morning. What are 2 things you've learned? This is also helpful for me because I wasn't able to attend yesterday. So you're sharing your knowledge with me as well. So 2 things you've learned at SequoiaCon. While you retrieve, I'm just going to put up a link and QR code again to the website with the materials that I mentioned, retrievalpractice.org/evergreen. Yeah, Vanessa, you're already doing what's in line with research. Give us about 30 more seconds. If you've already retrieved 2 things, add a 3rd thing. If you're still working on your 2, please continue. Okay, we're going to continue. I hope that both models retrieval practice for you and is helpful for your own learning. So many of us have sat through so much PD and then we forget it all. So I don't want you to forget what you've learned here at SequoiaCon as well. Now we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A. You can type in your questions into the chat. Derek is going to jump in and moderate to get some of your questions and juices flowing. Here's some topics I'd love to chat about. Again, I've got so many more additional strategies in my book, Powerful Teaching. I'm happy to troubleshoot challenges, talk about successes I've had, grading and assessment, equity and inclusion, and how to get students, parents, the rest of your district on board. While you're typing in your questions into the chat, there is a QR code there on the bottom right of your screen. SequoiaCon is providing a free copy of Powerful Teaching for all of you. So please use that QR code to fill out the Google form where you just put in your address and then you will get a copy of my book. So I'll turn it over to Derek. And where would you like to start?
I'd like to start by saying free, it's baked into the price of attendance. So you, but yeah, please fill out that form if you haven't. We've had a lot of responses on it. It's also on the website. So I'll start with a question of my own, if you don't mind. And we have tons that have come through and will continue to come through. So one of my fears is that AI will be used to maybe offload knowledge, for lack of a better word. So relying on retrieving information from a machine instead of, their own mind. So yeah, I guess what would you say to a critic who says, in a world of AI, I'm dubious about the value of remembered facts?
Yeah, I love that question. And 2 things come to mind. One, again, is a quote I shared at the beginning. In order for students to think, they have to have something to think about. And there's an element of ChatGPT that provides us with some information. So for example, I went to Spain a few months ago. I typed into ChatGPT, give me a 10-day itinerary of Spain. Yeah, of traveling through southern Spain. It was great at that. I've typed in what's the best way to store tomatoes. I'll Google that stuff as well. I've typed in, as many of us have, I've typed in some questions I asked my students to see what ChatGPT gives me back. So for example, I've asked my students and asked ChatGPT first, give me an example of the serial position effect related to music. Briefly to geek out, maybe Derek, you remember this, the serial position effect, do you remember it? No, see, we forget things. That's okay, that's how forgetting works, right? Serial position effect is how we remember the beginning of things and the end of things, but not the middle. So I can tell you the beginning and end of The Princess Bride, and I know the plot, but I can't really tell you the middle, right? So I asked ChatGPT, what's an example in music? It gave me a great example. And my students could copy and paste that into one of my mini quizzes. But then when we have a conversation in class, oh, they're gonna struggle. So I think one thing is we still need our students to think in a higher order, more critical way than AI currently can get humans to do. AI can do it a little bit for us, but I think a true value of education is literally the critical thinking about the world and the content we're learning. I also have conversations with my students. I ask them to reflect on whether or not people who over rely on AI will be replaced by AI. It's a question I pose to them. And a lot of them, when they think about it, will say no. Does that mean they don't use it? Of course not. My students use ChatGPT, but we talk about it. And I think having that conversation with our students is so important.
That's, yeah, I appreciate it. Phenomenal answer. I actually do remember the cereal after you reminded me. I didn't remember the label for it, but that we remember, early and recent experiences. No, phenomenal. It's almost as if retrieval practice is the antidote to that fear, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll move to another one. Kelly Lane had a great point that AI now enables us to think, discuss it with a chatbot, think again, and then pair share. So what are your thoughts about the ways in which a technology, especially one that you could argue passes the Turing test, as a partner in some of these retrieval practices? And feel free to be, completely honest here. I think a lot of the attendees probably share a fairly optimistic but still guarded approach. So if you're like, hey, nope, this is not the time for a chatbot, feel free to be candid.
Yeah, I think chatbots are great, to be candid. And I really appreciated looking through the descriptions of the other sessions because, again, I could see the vibe of feeling nervous, which makes sense. I was nervous as well. And a vibe of, well, it's here. So what are we going to do about it? And how can we use this as an educational tool? So I know I, of course, follow plenty of blogs and news articles about this. And I think I've seen a lot of value to using chatbots and ChatGPT for revising writing, or to have ChatGPT write something, and then to use that as a springboard for what did it do well and what did it not do well. I think chatbots can be helpful and can actually reduce some of that classroom anxiety when students don't want to participate or don't want to speak up in class. If it feels safe to use a chatbot, I fully support that. I think, again, having conversations about cheating or plagiarism or over-reliance is important. So on my Google Forms, for example, I set a classroom culture where I want students to be honest with me. So I tell them on this Google form, and we talk about it in class, if you've used ChatGPT, if you've used Google Translate, if you've used Google in general, if you've looked at Wikipedia, just tell me. Just, select a check mark on my Google form. And I encourage them by saying, look, if those tools exist, I use them, we use them. I, as an educator, can tell if the language in the writing is in line with the language you use in person. And I can tell when stuff sounds too scientific-y, to make that an official word, right? I can tell if stuff is too scientific-y. And so if my students are honest with me, then they're less likely to get in trouble. And I think they appreciate that perspective as well. So if it's using chatbots, great. But I think having conversations with students in a transparent way is also really important.
Yeah, I love that response as well. And I think that really dovetails pretty nice. I don't know if Laurel's in the room, but our morning keynote yesterday, I think those really couple well together. Matt Carabinos, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, Matt, shared fairly candidly that saving on prep time and grading may have been the main focus for most of us using AI in the first place. His district began pushing the SLOTS, SLOTS training for retrieval practice in math, but feels it can be applied to grammar ELA too. So this is a practice specific. First, are you aware of the SLOTS practice? So Matt, if you don't mind, unmuting yourself and just sharing, because I also was not, and you know, I did a quick Google search, but it was finding slot machine like probability stuff from that. So
Yeah. I was jealous of the session descriptions that said about how we as teachers and educators can use AI to save us time. And I'm like, oh, I need to look into that. So I would love any tools or tips as well. I've got more than 100 college students every semester.
and I don't know if Matt's, we can go back. So it probably if he wanted to know if that practice fit into retrieval practice or if it felt a bit too much. So Matt, if you come back, feel free to provide a little more context, but I'll move on. So I think more than the sake of, you know, more than standards for the sake of standards, that we all want to build practices that develop skills and synthesize and use facts for application of knowledge and transfer of knowledge. So what does retrieval practice research have to say about maybe like transfer of skills or skill acquisition, or transfer of knowledge into skill acquisition?
Yeah. I will, as I like to say, multi-fail. We cannot multitask. So if you're ever interested in that, let me know. But I'll put here a link in the chat, retrievalpractice.org/transfer. I forgot to mention the downloads on my website. I've also got about very quick, simple 10-page PDFs for teachers written by scientists. And one of them is a guide, a PDF practice guide that we have on transfer of knowledge specifically. One area of research is on what we call retrieval-induced facilitation, which sounds fancy, but it's really something that's intuitive to all of us. If you retrieve what you know about World War II, that is likely going to help you understand and facilitate your knowledge around other wars or other situations or other international politics and international relations. The more we retrieve, the more it sort of expands out. And that retrieval helps with the transfer of knowledge, the application of knowledge, and skill acquisition as well. So the more my students practice their guitar and engage in that retrieval, that spreads to the retrieval and practice of other stringed instruments or the piano, and understanding music in different ways as well. So I'm not sure if that was a simple answer to a more complex question, Derek.
No, I think that's an excellent answer, and I think it also points to more resources for everybody looking to dive into that. Tom had asked, and this, I shared this experience with the cereal example earlier. Why did I have to glance at my Evernote before I was able to recall things I learned, and then things seem to come back so quickly?
Yeah. Well, I'll first say a lot of us have reliance on notes. And I'm making some assumptions, but thank you for those on video. It looked like some of you were taking notes during this conversation right here because we have this concern about forgetting, which makes sense. We want to remember things. One thing I spend a lot of time on in my classrooms as well is normalizing forgetting. Like I had said to Derek took my class 5 years ago. Derek kind of forgot this fancy word for something that made sense, right? But I tell my students we forget, and it's okay to forget. I was recently emailing with a teacher who had used this phrase that I love, which is that we have learning FOMO, right? Where it's like, oh, but I've learned that thing and then I've forgotten that thing. And so I have to write down everything that happened in the Zoom so that I don't forget the thing. It's like, well, actually forgetting's okay. And our brains are not built to remember everything. It's adaptive for us to forget. But when we use strategies like retrieval to help us remember, that's what's going to stick with us. What we think about is what we remember. So I think part of using Evernote or looking at our Google Docs, I do the same thing. I mean, I wrote down slots right here so I don't forget to look it up. But we have this need to, or this desire to remember everything, and forgetting's okay. And to more specifically answer your question, looking at Evernote or notes in general provides us with what we call a retrieval cue. So if I say to Derek, you know, I can remember the beginning and ends of my favorite movies. Derek, can you give me another example? Derek might be able to for a podcast or vacation. We remember the beginning and ends of our vacations.
I think the example you used in class 5 years ago was presidents. You know, you can remember the first couple of presidents, maybe the most recent presidents, but the ones you forget, apart from maybe notable ones, kind of get lost.
Yes, exactly. And that was researched by my mentor, Henry Roediger, one of the authors of Make It Stick as well. So yeah, we have this retrieval cue when we and your students are like, oh, right, that's the thing. And there's really cool research on this thing called tip of the tongue that a lot of us have experienced. So you can think of that as a retrieval cue, which reminds me, sometimes when a student can't remember, we want to jump in to help them. I want to jump in to help my students. It's hard to see them struggle with something. Try to remind yourself and remind your students, this is going to be hard. And that's the intention. Just stick with it. And if a student can't remember, then think about giving them a retrieval cue, a word, something associated, rather than just telling them the answer. So what do you remember about what a neuron is? There are two types of signals in the brain. And if I get blank looks from my students, I'll say, well, one you could call sparks and one you could call juice. And then they'll say, oh, yeah, electrical and chemical activity. So that's an example of a retrieval cue that then sparks the memory.
That's great. And probably time for one more. Daniel had asked if there was any difference in the research that you found between males and females in the effect of retrieval, or feel free to extend that to other sort of maybe demographical markers.
Yeah, no difference is the simplistic answer. Again, learning is universal. Teaching is universal. And again, it's something I find really fascinating, is the way we learn kind of transcends age, race, gender identities. We all kind of learn in the same way. We have individual differences. Different people are better at remembering different things, but there don't appear to be any specific demographical patterns. So that's again why I like some of these strategies, because you can ask a kindergartner, what'd you learn in school yesterday? And I can ask my college students, what'd you learn in school yesterday? Great question.
That's phenomenal. Well, appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. A lot of love in the chat for your session. And yeah, thank you for allowing us to offer this book to the attendees and for providing that link. That's, yeah, I think you shared the QR code earlier. We also put it on the website. So
I'd like to jump in with
to dive in there.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in with just a little takeaway. Because I hope, again, as Ryan kind of set this off, is what can we do with this stuff? So I've provided a lot of practical strategies, but I also want us to just take a step back and imagine and think about our classrooms, our districts, our systems that would finally be based on the science of learning instead of based on fads and anecdotes, where rather than typically focusing on getting information into your students' heads, you're focusing on getting information out of students' heads, where rather than feeling like this look on their face is a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's a desirable difficulty to engage in that mental struggle. These strategies improve confidence and success and grades for students. Parents can use this at home. Students can use these strategies independently. You could ask students to retrieve while they're waiting for the school bus. In PD and district meetings, rather than reviewing the agenda, ask people what you talked about at the last district meeting, because we can start modeling that as educators as well. So instead of this frustrating cycle of forgetting and reteaching, let's move on to learning. So how many bones are in the human body? If you type it into the chat. Yeah, it's 206. So if that's the only thing you remember, I hope you will unleash the science of learning in your schools and districts. So thank you so much for your attention on this Friday. Please keep in touch. Here is my contact info and that website again. So thank you, Derek, to Evergreen, SequoiaCon as well. Thank you all.